I already told you to stop. You need to back away from the restricted area immediately, sir.
This is my ship. I have every right to be here.
The Admiral stared at the dead console, then turned to his chief engineer and said 5 words that echoed across the bridge. "You're telling me we're stranded. 4,200 sailors, 86 aircraft, 100,000 tons of American steel sitting motionless in the Atlantic during the largest joint NATO exercise in 15 years. And not a single engineer aboard the USS Constellation could figure out why. They had degrees from Annapolis and MIT. They had 30 combined years of nuclear propulsion training. They had access to every technical manual ever printed for a Nimitz-class carrier. And they had nothing. But 600 yards away, standing on the concrete pier of Naval Station Norfolk with a push broom in his hands and grease under his fingernails that had been there since 1971, a 68-year-old dock cleaner named Earl Jennings heard the emergency klaxon carry across the water and stopped sweeping. He tilted his head. He listened. And something behind his eyes changed. If you believe that real heroes don't always wear uniforms, comment respect right now. Earl Jennings had worked the docks at Naval Station Norfolk for 11 years. He showed up every morning at 5:15, 45 minutes before his shift started because that was what felt right. He parked his 1998 Ford Ranger in the same spot at the far end of the civilian lot. The spot nobody else wanted because it was next to the dumpsters and a quarter-mile from the entrance. He wore the same navy blue coveralls every day, washed every Sunday night, and hung to dry on the shower rod in his one-bedroom apartment on Granby Street. His badge read, Facilities Maintenance Contractor, in small block letters beneath a photo that had been taken when he first started and never updated. In the photo he looked 57. Now he looked like a man who had lived every single day of those 68 years, and carried each one in the lines around his eyes. The other dock workers knew him as Earl. Quiet Earl. The guy who swept the piers and emptied the trash cans and never complained about the pay, which was $14.60 an hour. No benefits, no retirement, no nothing. The younger contractors called him Pops when they acknowledged him at all, which wasn't often. The active duty sailors walking past him every morning didn't acknowledge him at all. He was invisible the way all old men doing humble work become invisible. A fixture, part of the concrete and the salt air and the endless grey paint of the naval station. Nobody asked Earl about his past. Nobody wondered why a man his age was pushing a broom at a military installation instead of sitting on a porch somewhere. Nobody noticed the way he sometimes stopped and watched the carriers with an expression that wasn't admiration or nostalgia, but something deeper and more precise. The way a surgeon might watch another surgeon work. The way a concert pianist might listen to someone else play a piece he once performed from memory. The USS Constellation had arrived at Norfolk 3 days earlier for what the Navy called Exercise Atlantic Resolve, a 16-nation naval exercise designed to demonstrate Allied readiness in the North Atlantic. The carrier was the centerpiece. Everything revolved around her. The destroyers and frigates and submarines from 12 countries were positioned to support and protect her. The air wings from 4 nations were staged to launch from her deck. The entire exercise had been planned for 14 months, and at its center sat the Constellation and her 2 Westinghouse 4W nuclear reactors, each one capable of generating over 100 megawatts of thermal energy, enough to power a small city, enough to drive a 100,000-ton warship at speeds over 30 knots for 20 years without refueling. Except right now, on a Tuesday morning in October, with Allied commanders watching from a dozen ships and the Pentagon monitoring from Washington, Reactor Number 2 was offline, and Reactor Number 1 was producing erratic output that made the chief engineer's face go the colour of old chalk. Commander David Chen was the Constellation's chief engineer, and he was having the worst morning of his career. He stood in the primary engineering control room 3 decks below the waterline, surrounded by consoles and gauges and 18 of his best technicians, and he could not figure out what was wrong. The diagnostics said one thing, the gauges said another. The reactor was behaving like it had a mind of its own, cycling through power outputs that made no mechanical sense. It wasn't a coolant leak. They'd checked. It wasn't a control rod malfunction. They'd verified every single one. It wasn't the steam generators, the turbines, the reduction gears, or any of the 100 other components that could theoretically fail. Everything checked out on paper, but the reactor disagreed with the paper, and in the hierarchy of authority between engineering manuals and physical reality always wins. Chen had called down to Norfolk's shore-based engineering support. He'd conferenced with the Naval Reactors Division in Washington. He'd even reached out to Westinghouse's technical team in Pittsburgh. Everyone had theories, nobody had answers, and every hour that passed was another hour the Constellation sat dead in the water while Allied commanders exchanged glances and Russian surveillance satellites photographed the whole thing. Captain Robert Hayes stood on the bridge and watched the morning light move across an ocean he couldn't sail on. He was 52 years old, a career surface warfare officer who had commanded destroyers and cruisers before earning this posting. The pinnacle of any naval officer's career, command of a nuclear aircraft carrier. He had imagined many challenges. He had prepared for combat, for storms, for mechanical failures, for personnel crises. He had not prepared for the particular humiliation of sitting motionless at the pier during a NATO exercise because his engineers couldn't figure out what was wrong with his ship. The phone on the bridge console rang. It was Admiral Catherine Morales, commander of Carrier Strike Group 8, calling from the command ship USS Way City, positioned 12 miles offshore. Her voice was measured and professional, which made it worse. "Robert, I need a timeline." Hayes looked at Chen's latest update on his tablet. Reactor 2 remained offline. Reactor 1 was producing 63% output, then 41, then 78, cycling with no discernible pattern. "Admiral, my chief engineer is working the problem. We're exploring every possibility." A pause. "Robert, the Secretary of Defense is watching this exercise. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is watching this exercise. 14 allied nations are watching this exercise. I need more than exploring every possibility. I need power to those shafts." "Yes, ma'am. We'll have an update within the hour." He hung up and stared at the harbour. Down on the pier, 100 feet below, he could see a man in blue coveralls sweeping near the forward brow, pushing a broom while the most powerful warship in the world sat helpless. Hayes turned away. Earl heard the conversations the way he heard everything on the docks, through the thin walls of open hatches, through the words of sailors smoking on the fantail, through the radio chatter that drifted from open bridge wings on warm days. He didn't seek out information. Information found him the way it finds anyone who is quiet and present and pays attention. By 9:30 that morning, he knew the basics. Reactor 2 was completely down. Reactor 1 was cycling erratically. The engineering team was stumped. The exercise was stalled. He kept sweeping. He swept the pier from the forward brow all the way aft, past the massive mooring lines thick as a man's thigh, past the shore power cables that were currently feeding the Constellation's hotel loads because her own reactors couldn't be trusted. He swept, and he listened, and he thought. At 10:15, a group of 4 engineers came down the afterbrow for a smoke break. They were young men, late 20s and early 30s, haggard and frustrated, their coveralls stained with the particular mix of sweat and hydraulic fluid that comes from working in the belly of a warship under pressure. They stood in a loose circle near the bollards and talked the way engineers talk when they're beaten, in fragments, in technical shorthand, in the frustrated language of people who know they should have the answer but don't. Earl was 15 feet away, pushing his broom along the edge of the pier, close enough to hear, close enough to catch the words that mattered. "Main coolant pump 3 is showing normal flow, but the thermal readings are all over the place," one of them said, a lieutenant with dark circles under his eyes. "We've replaced the thermocouple twice, same readings." "It's not the thermocouple," another said. "I'm telling you, it's somewhere in the secondary loop. The steam generators are getting inconsistent input." "We checked the secondary loop. We checked it 6 times. Then check it 7. With what? We've pulled every schematic. We've run every diagnostic. Commander Chen has been on the phone with naval reactors for 3 hours. Nobody knows." They stood in silence for a moment. One of them looked out at the water, another checked his phone. The one who had been speaking last kicked a pebble off the pier. "You know what kills me?" the lieutenant said. "This plant is basically the same design they've been running since the 70s. My grandfather's generation built these things. Guys with slide rules and no computers, and we can't figure out what's wrong with it using every piece of technology on Earth." Earl stopped sweeping. He didn't mean to stop. His body just stopped, the way a hunting dog freezes when it catches a scent. He stood there with the broom in his hands and his head slightly tilted and his eyes focused on something that wasn't the pier or the ship or the engineers, but was instead somewhere deep inside his own memory, a place he hadn't visited in a long time. The lieutenant's words echoed in his head. Basically the same design since the 70s. Guys with slide rules, main coolant pump, thermal readings all over the place, Secondary loop checks clean. He knew this. Not the way someone knows something they've read about or studied. He knew this the way his hands knew the broom handle, the way his legs knew the walk from the parking lot, the way his lungs knew the salt air. He knew it in his bones. Earl Jennings had not always pushed a broom. From 1974 to 1998, 24 years, he had served in the United States Navy as a machinist mate, and later as a reactor technician, aboard 3 different nuclear-powered warships. He had qualified as an engineering watch supervisor on the USS Nimitz, the lead ship of her class, during her first full deployment. He had been part of the original team that solved the thermal cycling problem on the Nimitz's No. 1 reactor in 1977, a problem that had baffled engineers for weeks until Earl, then a 20-year-old petty officer third class with no college degree and a high school education from rural Virginia, had traced it to a harmonic vibration in the primary coolant pump housing that only manifested at specific power levels. He had served 24 years. He had earned the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer, E8. He had received 2 Navy Commendation Medals, a Meritorious Service Medal, and a letter of commendation from the Chief of Naval Operations himself. And when he retired in 1998 at the age of 42, he had more direct operational hours on Westinghouse A, 4W reactors than anyone in the fleet. That was the past. The past was something Earl kept in a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet next to his dress blues that still fit because he was the same weight now as he was at 20. He didn't talk about the Navy. He didn't wear a veteran's hat or put a bumper sticker on his truck. He didn't go to the VFW or attend reunions, not because he was ashamed, not because he didn't care, because the Navy was something he had done, completely and fully, and when it was over he had walked away and built whatever life came next, which turned out to be a series of maintenance jobs that paid little and asked less, which was fine by Earl, who had never needed much. But standing on that pier with the broom in his hands and the frustrated voices of those young engineers in his ears, something stirred, something that had been quiet for a very long time. He set the broom against a bollard and walked toward the group. They didn't notice him at first. He was just the old dock sweeper, part of the scenery. When he stopped in front of them, they looked at him with the vaguely impatient expression people reserve for interruptions they consider irrelevant. "Excuse me," Earl said. His voice was quiet, a little rough at the edges, the voice of a man who didn't use it much. "I couldn't help but overhear." The lieutenant looked at his colleagues. One of them smirked. "Overhear what?" "Your reactor problem. The thermal cycling on the primary loop." The smirk on the young engineer's face widened. "No offence, sir, but this is a classified engineering issue. We can't really discuss it." "I understand that," Earl said, "but I think I might know what's wrong." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that precedes either a laugh or a dismissal. The lieutenant chose a version of both. "With all due respect, sir, we've got a team of nuclear-trained engineers working on this. I don't think—" "It's the primary coolant pump housing," Earl said. "No. 3 pump, port side, reactor 1. The smirk disappeared. The lieutenant stared at him. "How do you know which pump it is?" "Because the thermal readings are cycling, but your flow rates are steady. That means the problem isn't in the fluid dynamics, it's mechanical. You've got a harmonic vibration in the pump housing that's transferring heat irregularly to the thermocouple mounts. Your readings are wrong because the thermocouples are reading their own vibration-generated heat, not the actual coolant temperature. The reactor is fine, your instruments are lying to you." Nobody spoke. One of the engineers had his mouth slightly open. The lieutenant looked at Earl as though he were seeing him for the first time, which, in a sense, he was. "And reactor 2? Lieutenant asked quietly. "If it's the same class of pump and the vibration propagated through the shared mounting structure, the automated safety systems would have scrammed it as a precaution. Check the pump housings for microfractures in the mounting bolts, specifically the aft starboard bolts on each pump. They've got a known fatigue issue that Westinghouse flagged in Technical Bulletin 84-307, which I'm guessing nobody has pulled because it was issued in 1984, and nobody thinks to look at documents that are 40 years old." The lieutenant pulled out his phone and started typing. Then he stopped and looked at Earl. "Who are you?" Earl looked at the ship, that long, quiet look he always gave the carriers when nobody was watching. "Just a guy who used to work on these things." The engineers went back aboard. Earl picked up his broom and went back to sweeping. He figured that was the end of it. He'd said his piece, offered what he knew, and now it was up to the people with the clearances and the authority and the uniforms to do what they would with it. He didn't expect to hear anything more about it. He certainly didn't expect what happened 45 minutes later. He was sweeping near the forward brow when he heard footsteps on the metal gangway above him. Quick, purposeful footsteps. Multiple sets of them. He looked up. 4 people were coming down the brow. The lieutenant from the smoking group. Another officer he didn't recognize. A commander by the insignia on his collar. A Master Chief Petty Officer. And a woman in civilian clothes carrying a tablet. They walked directly to him. The commander spoke first. "Are you the one who told my engineers about the pump housing vibration?" Earl leaned the broom against the pier railing. "Yes, sir." "Commander David Chen, Chief Engineer, USS Constellation." He didn't extend his hand. His expression was guarded, the look of a man who was simultaneously desperate and skeptical. "My lieutenant says you diagnosed our reactor problem in 30 seconds from the pier." I just told him what I thought based on what I overheard. "He also says you referenced a Westinghouse Technical Bulletin from 1984 by number." Earl nodded. 84-307, issued March of that year. Applies to all 4W installations commissioned between 1972 and 1986. Commander Chen stared at him for a long time. Then he said, "I need you to come aboard." Earl looked down at his coveralls, at his push broom, at his contractor badge that said Facilities Maintenance. "Commander, I don't have clearance to be anywhere near your engineering spaces." "I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that I have a dead carrier, an Admiral who needs answers, and you apparently have more knowledge of my reactor plant than anyone currently on my ship. I'll handle the clearance. Will you come aboard?" Earl looked at the ship, at the massive grey hull rising above him like a cliff face. He had walked away from this world 26 years ago. He had made his peace with it. He had built a small, quiet life that didn't need the Navy and didn't need anyone to know what he had been. But the ship was broken, and he knew how to fix it. "Yes, sir." Walking through the passageways of the Constellation was like walking through a dream that was almost but not quite the same as something he remembered. The layout was familiar. All Nimitz-class carriers shared the same basic design. But everything was newer, cleaner, more digital than the ships he had served on. Where he remembered analog gauges, there were flat-screen displays. Where he remembered manual valve controls, there were electronic actuators. But beneath all of it, beneath the upgrades and the modernization, and the 40 years of technological advancement, the bones were the same. The reactor plant was the same. Earl could feel it in his feet through the deck plates, the subtle vibration of a ship that was alive but not well. Commander Chen led him through a series of security checkpoints, each one requiring a phone call and a lengthy explanation that got shorter as they progressed deeper into the ship because word was travelling faster than they were. By the time they reached the primary engineering control room, every technician in the space had heard some version of the story. An old dock cleaner was coming down to look at the reactor. The reactions ranged from disbelief to amusement to outright hostility. Earl stepped into the engineering control room and stopped. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he enters a church or visits a grave. His eyes moved across the consoles, the displays, the gauges. His hands hung at his sides, but his fingers were moving slightly, unconsciously, as though they were touching controls that existed only in his memory. "The primary coolant displays," he said quietly. "May I see them?" A technician looked at Commander Chen, who nodded. The technician brought up the display. Earl studied it for less than 10 seconds. "There," he said, pointing to a waveform on the screen. "You see that oscillation? That's not thermal variation. That's mechanical. 7.2 Hz. That's the natural frequency of the pump housing when the aft mounting bolts lose tension. The pump is running fine. The coolant is flowing fine. But the housing is vibrating at resonance and it's transferring micro-oscillations to every sensor mounted on that section of piping." He turned to Chen. "Do you have a stethoscope? A mechanic's stethoscope?" Someone produced one. Earl took it, and for the first time since he had walked aboard, his hands looked like they belonged exactly where they were. He moved to a section of piping that ran along the aft bulkhead, placed the stethoscope against it, and listened. The room was silent. 20 people watched a man in blue janitorial coveralls listen to a pipe, with the focus and concentration of a cardiologist listening to a heartbeat. Earl moved the stethoscope 6 inches to the left, listened again, moved it again. Then he straightened up and said, "Pump 3, port side. The aft starboard mounting bolt has fatigued. You can hear the chatter through the pipe. It's subtle, but it's there. It's been there for a while, probably got worse over the last few operating cycles. The vibration propagated through the shared mounting plate to pump 4, which tripped the automated protection system on reactor 2. Your reactors are healthy. Your pumps are healthy. You've got 2 bad bolts and some sensor mounts that need to be re-isolated from the housing vibration. Commander Chen turned to his senior technician. Get a team on pump 3, now. Check the mounting bolts exactly as he described. The technician hesitated. Sir, we'd need to partially disassemble the housing to access those bolts. That's a 6-hour procedure. Then you'd better start immediately. He turned back to Earl. You're sure about this? Earl met his eyes. Commander, I was the engineering watch supervisor on the Nimitz when we had this exact same problem in 1977. Same pump design, same failure mode, same confusing thermal readings. We spent 2 weeks chasing ghosts before I traced it to the mounting bolts. Westinghouse issued the technical bulletin afterward based on our findings. Chen's expression changed. It shifted from guarded skepticism to something that looked like the beginning of understanding. You served on the Nimitz? CVN-68, Reactor Department, 1974 to 1984. Then the Eisenhower, then the Vinson. 24 years total, retired as a senior chief. Senior Chief Jennings. That's what they used to call me. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the phone on the nearest console and dialed the bridge. Captain Hayes arrived in the engineering control room 17 minutes later, which was approximately 16 minutes faster than a carrier captain would normally transit that distance. He came through the hatch with the controlled urgency of a man who has received extraordinary news and is trying not to let it show on his face. He looked at Earl. He looked at Commander Chen. He looked at the team that was already preparing to access the pump housing. "This is the man?" he asked Chen. "Yes, sir. This is Earl Jennings, Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired, 24 years in reactor departments. He diagnosed the problem from the pier." Hayes extended his hand. Earl shook it. The captain's grip was firm and his eyes were searching. "Senior Chief Commander Chen tells me you believe the issue is mechanical vibration in the pump housings, not a reactor problem." "That's correct, sir. And you're confident in this assessment?" "Yes, sir. I've seen this failure before. I'm the one who identified it the first time." Hayes studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to Chen. "How long to verify and correct?" "If he's right, sir, we're looking at 6 to 8 hours to access, inspect and replace the mounting bolts on both pumps. Then another 2 to 4 hours for testing and reactor restart. So we could have power by tonight." "If Senior Chief Jennings is right, yes, sir." Hayes looked at Earl again. "Senior Chief, I need to make a call to the Admiral. She's going to want to know everything. Would you be willing to stay aboard and consult with the engineering team during the repair?" Earl looked around the engineering control room, at the young technicians in their clean coveralls, at the consoles that were newer versions of the ones his hands had once known by touch, at the pipes and valves and gauges that spoke a language he had never forgotten. "I don't have anywhere else to be, Captain." The repair took 7 hours. Earl didn't do the physical work himself. His contractor status and the security protocols wouldn't allow it, and his 68-year-old knees wouldn't have appreciated it either. But he stood next to the team the entire time, guiding them through the procedure with a calm, steady precision that the younger engineers had never seen from anyone. Not their instructors at nuclear power school, not their supervisors, not the engineers from Westinghouse who occasionally came aboard for technical consultations. He knew every bolt, every gasket, every torque specification. He knew which way the housing tended to shift when you loosened the forward bolts. He knew the trick of using a thin shim to hold the alignment while you seated the new hardware. He knew things that weren't in any manual because they were the kind of things you only learn by doing the work 1,000 times with your own hands. The younger technicians, the ones who had smirked or rolled their eyes when they first heard a dock cleaner was being brought to their engineering spaces, grew quiet as they watched him work. Not quiet from embarrassment, though some of that was there too. Quiet from something more like awe, because what they were witnessing was mastery. Pure, earned, bone-deep mastery of a trade that most people would never know existed. When the after starboard mounting bolt on pump 3 was removed, it confirmed everything Earl had said. The bolt showed clear signs of fatigue cracking at the shoulder, invisible to external inspection, but devastating in its effect. The vibration it had allowed was tiny, fractions of a millimeter, but at the resonant frequency of the housing, it had been enough to corrupt every thermal reading on the primary loop. Pump 4 on reactor 2 showed identical fatigue on the corresponding bolt. The automated safety system had scrammed the reactor exactly as designed, responding to readings that appeared to show a dangerous thermal excursion, but were in fact phantom signals generated by mechanical vibration. The reactors had been healthy the entire time. The ship had been healthy. 2 bolts, 2 small pieces of hardened steel, each one worth about $4, had disabled the most powerful warship in the United States Navy. At 8:47 that evening, Reactor 2 came back online. At 9:12, Reactor 1 was producing stable output at 100%. At 9:31, the Constellation reported to Carrier Strike Group 8 that she was fully operational and ready for sea. At 9:45, Captain Hayes received a call from Admiral Morales. She wanted a full debrief. She also wanted to meet the man who had fixed her carrier. The meeting happened on the bridge at 10:15. Admiral Catherine Morales was a small woman with short grey hair and the kind of presence that made every room she entered feel like it had been built specifically for her. She had commanded destroyers, an amphibious assault ship, and a carrier strike group. She had earned her stars in an era when women in the Navy had to be twice as good to get half the recognition, and she had been 4 times as good and gotten exactly what she deserved. She came aboard the Constellation by helicopter, which was unusual for a meeting that could have been conducted by phone, and which told everyone who understood Navy protocol that this was not a routine visit. Earl was standing on the bridge in his blue coveralls, his contractor badge still hanging from his chest, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that was unconscious and unmistakable. The posture of a man who had stood watch on Navy bridges for 24 years. He hadn't assumed the posture deliberately. His body simply remembered where it was. Admiral Morales walked onto the bridge, returned the salutes of the officers present, and stopped in front of Earl. She looked at him. He looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Senior Chief Jennings," she said. Earl blinked. "You know my name, Admiral?" "I know more than your name." She turned to Captain Hayes. "Captain, did Senior Chief Jennings tell you how I know him?" Hayes shook his head. The Admiral looked back at Earl, and something in her expression softened. Not into sentimentality, but into the kind of respect that exists between people who have shared something most others will never understand. In 1991, I was a lieutenant junior grade aboard the USS Eisenhower. Brand new, first deployment, terrified but too stubborn to show it. I was assigned to the engineering department, which in those days was not a welcoming place for a woman. The chief of the reactor department took one look at me and told his people to make sure I didn't break anything. She paused. There was one person in that department who treated me like an engineer instead of a problem. One person who taught me how to read the reactor the way a doctor reads a patient. Not just the instruments, but the feel of the plant, the sound of it, the way the deck vibrated when everything was right, and the way it changed when something wasn't. One person who, when the other chiefs tried to push me out, stood up in the chief's mess and said that any sailor who earned their qualifications deserved to be there. Full stop. And that anyone who disagreed could take it up with him. She looked at Earl. That person was Senior Chief Earl Jennings. The bridge was silent. Captain Hayes stared at the old man in the blue coveralls. Commander Chen, who had followed the Admiral aboard, stood very still. The officer of the deck, a young lieutenant, had stopped writing in the deck log. Earl looked at Admiral Morales, and for the first time since he had walked aboard that morning, his composure shifted. Not cracked. Earl Jennings didn't crack, but shifted, the way a foundation shifts when something that has been pressing against it for a very long time is finally released. "I remember you, Ma'am," he said quietly. "Lieutenant Morales, you were the best junior engineer I ever trained." "I was the best junior engineer anyone ever trained," she corrected, and then she smiled. And Earl smiled back, and something passed between them that was beyond rank or time or circumstance. The Admiral turned back to Captain Hayes. "Captain, I want a formal report on today's events submitted to NAVSEA and the Chief of Naval Operations. I want Senior Chief Jennings' contribution fully documented. I want the technical bulletin he referenced, TB 84-307, reissued as a mandatory inspection item for all A4W installations in the fleet. And I want someone to explain to me why a man with more reactor time than anyone in the Navy is pushing a broom on my pier instead of teaching at the nuclear power school." Hayes nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The Admiral looked at Earl one more time. Then she did something that made every officer on the bridge straighten involuntarily. She came to attention, and she saluted him. Not a casual gesture, not a symbolic nod. A full, precise regulation salute rendered by a 2-star Admiral to a retired senior chief petty officer in janitorial coveralls. Earl's hand came up before he could think about it. Muscle memory. 24 years of muscle memory. He returned the salute with the crispness of a man who had never stopped being a sailor, because in truth, he never had. "Welcome back aboard, Senior Chief," the Admiral said. 3 weeks later, the Chief of Naval Operations issued a fleet-wide directive mandating inspection of primary coolant pump mounting hardware on all Nimitz-class carriers, citing the analysis and recommendation of Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired Earl Jennings. Westinghouse reissued Technical Bulletin 84-307 with updated inspection criteria and a new foreword acknowledging the original identification of the failure mode by then Petty Officer 3rd Class Jennings in 1977. The Naval Nuclear Power Training Command in Charleston, South Carolina, invited Earl to serve as a consultant and guest instructor. He accepted. He drove his 1998 Ford Ranger from Norfolk to Charleston on a Sunday morning, arriving 45 minutes early because that was what felt right. On his first day, he stood in front of a classroom of young sailors and officers, men and women in their 20s who looked at him with the curious, slightly skeptical expression that young people always wear when an old person tells them he has something to teach them. He set his coffee on the podium, adjusted the microphone and said, "My name is Earl Jennings. I spent 24 years in reactor departments. I've forgotten more about these plants than most of you will ever learn, and I mean that as a statement of fact, not a boast. I'm here because an admiral who used to be a scared lieutenant told me to stop pushing a broom and start teaching. She was right. She usually is." He paused and looked out at them, every single face. "The most important thing I can teach you isn't in any manual, it's this. Listen to the ship, not the instruments, not the computers, the ship. She'll tell you what's wrong if you're quiet enough to hear her. The instruments can lie, the computers can lie, the ship never lies." The classroom was silent. Earl picked up his coffee and took a sip. "Now, let's talk about pump housing harmonics." Back at Naval Station Norfolk, the Constellation had departed for exercises and returned, and life on the piers had continued the way it always does. But something had changed. In the space where Earl used to park his truck, someone had painted a small blue anchor on the concrete, the symbol of the Navy's surface warfare community. Unofficial, unauthorized, but no one removed it. The dock workers who had called him Pops now told the story to every new hire who came through. The version grew in the telling, the way all good stories do, but the core of it stayed true. An old man with a broom heard a carrier die and brought her back to life with nothing but 40 years of knowledge and a mechanic's stethoscope. And at the Nuclear Power School in Charleston, in a small office at the end of a hallway that smelled of coffee and old technical manuals, Senior Chief Jennings sat at a desk with a nameplate that read, "Special Consultant Reactor Systems," and a framed photograph on the wall. The photograph showed a young man in a Navy dress uniform, 20 years old, standing on the deck of a brand new aircraft carrier with the sun behind him and the ocean stretching to the horizon. The young man was smiling. Earl looked at that photograph sometimes, the way a father looks at a picture of his son. That young man had built something with his life, and it turned out that what he built wasn't just a career or a set of skills or a record of service. What he built was something that couldn't be dismantled by retirement or age or obscurity. What he built was the kind of knowledge that waits. It waits in the hands and the ears and the bones of the person who earned it. It waits through years of silence and humble work and invisibility. And when it's needed, when the moment comes and the ship is broken and the young engineers are stumped and the admirals are watching, it rises. Not with fanfare, not with ego, just quietly. The way Earl Jennings walked up a gangway and listened to a pipe and saved a ship. If you believe that real heroes don't need recognition to be heroic, subscribe to this channel. Because every week, we tell the stories of people who prove that true worth doesn't expire, that service doesn't end with a discharge paper, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody's looking at.